Today we have an important lecture, but also problematic for me, I must say. So we are starting today the last part of the course, which is, I would say, the more conceptual / philosophical part. And it's challenging because several reasons. First, I'm not a professional philosopher. This is an advantage and disadvantage. But and second, that independent of what profession you are, things are complicated when you try to define things in philosophy. Is whatever it is, it's every word that you are using has connotations and debates, and it's not easy to sort out your way. And the last part is that in science, I was on firm grounds. I thought I'm most of the things that I said, I'm pretty much convinced about them. So you may disagree with me, but I could argue and try to persuade you that I'm right, with some success. In some of what I'm going to discuss today and in the next set of lectures, it will be a mix. Some of the things I think I'm pretty much convinced about them, and I'm kind of strongly committed to them, try to persuade you that I'm right. But others are tentative. I may not even have a firm position about them. So I encourage you even more to engage into active discussions. So, and this part of the course relies on minimal physics, and there is no equation, there are no equations and terminology and so on. So all of you, even those that are far from physics, should feel welcome to engage in questions and discussions and so on. Okay, so let's begin. So today's lecture is, the topic is reduction and emergence. In a way of beginning this or motivating this is one of the contemporary philosophers of cognitive neuroscience, or philosopher of the mind, John Searle, who wrote about the relation between mind and brain, consciousness, and particularly about consciousness. Consciousness is a higher level or emergent property of the brain. And I think much of today's lecture will be to unpack what it potentially means or implies that the brain is that the mind or consciousness. Today I won't make the distinction. Is emergent property of the brain. What it might mean and what are the implications. So here's the list of topics that I would like to discuss today. I may not finish all of them, we'll see. I'll start with reduction. I think most of you heard about the notion of reduction, reducing everything is reduced to physics or not, and so on. Reductionism, and emergence or emergentism. Then I'll discuss multiple realizability and universality. What is the same or different? But it's an important topic to discuss. Then I'll discuss emergence and its relation to causation, to causal powers. So there are two concepts here. One is emergent causation, another one is downward causation. And I'll conclude again, if I'll have time today, with a principle, which is the micro-physical closure. That's my version of that principle, the micro-physical closure principle. Okay. Let's then begin. All right. So I'll motivate it with the mind-body problem. Although the first part of the lecture today will be in the science, in the physical sciences. But nevertheless, the whole list of topics that we are discussing are motivated in the context of this course into trying to make sense of the mind-body problem. Okay. And the mind-body problem comes in several flavors or ways. You know, what is the relation between mind and brain? You can say not necessarily the brain, but the body. But I'll make it simple and say, what is the relation between mind and brain? Some people, some researchers, some philosophers, particularly specifically target consciousness. What is the relation between consciousness and the brain? And I'll talk about consciousness specifically in next week's lecture. So things like free will and consciousness will be elaborated on the next lecture. But now it's just part of what the mind. Another one is free will in the brain. Again, this will be specifically elaborated, discussed next lecture, but one version of mind-body problem, one jargon, which is more contemporary, is the mental physical. What is the relation between the mental and the physical? Because, you know, what is the mind? Who knows? Soul, spirit. Mental is kind of mental state, mental processes, things that psychology or cognitive sciences talk about. So what is the relation between the mental and physical? It's more modern version of the question of the mind-body question. Okay, so again, I'll just remind you to things that you all know, and we started the course with that, the classical dualism, Cartesian dualism, that has a firm position on the question of the mind-body. The mind and the brain are radically different kinds of entities, or substances, sometimes it's called. The brain is as a substance or entity, as a physical entity. It is localized in space and time. It's subject to all physical laws. When I say physical laws, physics, chemistry, biology, physical laws. The mind, in contrast, is a non-physical entity, or it's a different substance. It's not extended in the language of classical philosophy. In other words, it's not localized in space. You cannot say this is here and not there. And not only it's not extended, but it's not subject to physical laws. Okay, so something else. Okay, now we all know, and I think I mentioned it also in lecture 1, that whatever you think about the plausibility of this, having the main problem here is the interaction. Okay, if the mind is such a thing, which is very different, then how come it affects, how come it talks to the physical? And in particular, how come it affects the physical? Okay, and that will be a theme that will come back towards the end of today's lecture, but that's obvious. One of the reasons that makes dualism very not popular today. It's not the default. There are dualists even today, which is fine. It's not criminal, but most scientists, and I would say most philosophers also, will not subscribe themselves as a dualist. Not in the sense of substance dualism, which is what I'm talking about here, which means that two entities, that the mind is a different entity. There's some different substance. Most of us, may I say, scientists, philosophers, hold in contrary to dualism, monism. We are monists, and in particular, we are physicalist monists. You can say everything is spirit. I would say there are probably some literature on that as well. So it's also monism, but in a different way. We are monist in the sense of physicalism. So what does it mean we are monist? We say the mind is grounded in the brain. It's not something that is somehow around, suspended in air. And the brain consists of physical constituents obeying physical laws. Sometimes it's called physicalism, whatever, monism. Okay. So this I think is, as I said, most of what or all of what I'll discuss today will be in the framework of this physicalist approach or naturalist approach or monistic approach. Okay. And you all know that we will not do neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience or neuroscience. We will not actually do neuroscience if we're not having strongly committed to the idea that by studying the nervous system, you understand the mind and so on and so forth. So there is no reason to elaborate on that, I think. All right. But the question here, what does it mean the mind is grounded in the brain? In what sense is grounded? Okay. And that actually is the issue that I want to discuss today. Is it identity? The mind is equal to the brain. The mind is reduced to the brain. The mind is emergent of the brain, like John Searle said. It's emergent property of the brain. That's okay. Okay, but in order to try to make sense of these things, let's leave aside mind and let's talk about physics or physical sciences, because there you might imagine that things are simpler. There is no dualism. We all know we can all measure in the lab. We can all write mathematical equations about. Okay, so let's try to elaborate what reduction and emergence means within the physical sciences. Okay. So, but before doing that, okay, I'm sorry. Before doing that, again, as an appetizer for the discussion about mental and physical, I'm just bringing two famous quotations to show you two positions. Both of them are committed to monism, so they are not dualists. Not substance in this extreme Cartesian dualism. Both of them are monists. Nevertheless, they have very different perspective on the relation between mind and brain. Okay, and one quotation is from Francis Crick, the famous co-discoverer of the genetic code. But as most of you know, in his second academic career, he was very much interested in the neuroscience. And in his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, The Scientific Search for the Soul, a very famous book, very popular book, I encourage to read. He says the following, and then it's a very famous quotation: "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, your sense of free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." This is a very nice statement about reduction in the context of mental and physical. Okay, it's not only that the mental somehow are generated by the neural systems, but it's identity. It's no more but. It is the famous cliche of reductionism. They always will say, this is no more but. Okay, you are no more but a pack of neurons or a pack of molecules and so on. Okay, good. So that's one expression of the relation between the mind and the brain, and another one is by Roger Sperry, and also Nobel Prize, and his Nobel Prize lecture in 1981. By the way, Roger Sperry is famous for his a cognitive psychologist or neuroscientist, famous by the split brain studies, studies of patients, human patients, that under surgery, the two hemispheres were more or less cut off, split, and he studied. Sorry. Very famous set of experiments about split brains and what happened to their personalities, two personalities, one personality. And he got Nobel Prize on this. And what he says is that the events of inner experience as emergent properties of the brain process become themselves explanatory causal constructs in their own right, interacting at their own level with their own laws and dynamics. Okay, so again, monism, the mind, inner experience, are emergent properties of the brain processes. They are not something else. There is no spirit which is outside the physical laws. It is a product of the brain processes. Nevertheless, it's not no more than. It is more than, okay? It is, they become themselves explanatory causal constructs. And they have their own level of laws and dynamics. So somehow they became, in some sense, independent entities. So that's the two approaches, kind of extreme approaches, no more than brain processes, emergent properties of the brain, but they have their own life, as emergent properties. All right, so we have to now come back to physical sciences and talk first about reduction.
Haim, can I ask a question?
Sure. Please ask questions, interrupt me.
About the previous slide, in the second theory, so yeah, how can the mind be both has its own dynamics, but also controlled by the brain, like the physical? If there is contradiction, so what is it? Who would listen?
Yeah, that's a question which I'll come to at the end, hopefully at the end of today's lecture.
Okay.
But this is you rightly point to the difficulty. So you can say, well, I don't know. We will come back to more elaboration of what Sperry says about it. But indeed, there is an issue here. Okay.
Okay.
Good. But you pointed to the heart of the matter. What's going on here? Okay, but let's go back to a safer ground, which is physics or physical sciences. Okay, so let's first talk about reduction. So in physics itself, there are classical canonical examples of the idea of reduction. Reduction in the sense that phenomena and theories at one level are reduced to a lower level. Okay, so thermodynamics to statistical mechanics. We discussed this, macrophysics to microphysics, kind of more general than thermodynamics to statistical mechanics. For instance, hydrodynamics is an example of a macroscopic theory of fluids, gases or liquids, their transport properties, turbulence, and so on. They're all macroscopic laws in macroscopic physics, but can be reduced to Newtonian mechanics. Another case of macro to micro in physics is quantum. We discussed it a little bit, how coarse graining operates through decoherence to generate macroscopic kind of classical like physics from microphysics. Another one we didn't discuss, but optics to electromagnetism is again a classical game. We discussed electromagnetism, but classical optics is a way reduced to electromagnetism. See, this is all physics, but now beyond physics, chemistry to physics, or to quantum mechanics, basically. So you're talking about chemical bonds of various types. It's basically reduced to properties of wave functions of atoms and molecules and so on and so forth. And towards biology, genetics and molecular biology. Okay, what's interesting in those cases is that in all of them, essentially all of them, you can see historically that the macro part, the left part in this list, actually was developed as a theory, macro theory, before the micro counterpart was known, right? So thermodynamics was developed before even physicists knew that that everything consists of atoms and they have some degrees of freedom and so on and so forth. Thermodynamics laws, okay? And similarly, optics, similarly chemistry, chemical, the laws of chemistry were kind of independent of further future developments of quantum mechanics that explain the laws. And genetics, Mendeleev, hereditary laws are all developed way before people knew molecular biology. Okay. So what does it mean that they are reduced? Okay, that so what I'm giving you here is kind of a recipe or definition of reduction, which is known as Nagelian reduction, was formulated by Ernst Nagel, a philosopher, American philosopher. The notion of reduction is very ancient, but he can formulate, give it some formal definition, if you want. And basically, they consist of two. A reduction consists of two aspects, two steps. One step is have a vocabulary, a dictionary that translate the set of variables and objects and terms that exist in the high level or the macro level theory to the micro level theory or micro level phenomena. Because if you don't know to do this mapping, there is no way to reduce the laws. Okay, so that's one step. So for instance, temperature in thermodynamics, at least in ideal gases, is translated into mean kinetic energy of the molecules. Okay, so now the atoms. Now you can, using this translation, you can then ask whether you can, from the kinetics laws, you can derive the thermodynamic laws relating maybe equation of state and so on. Entropy is another example. If you want to derive relation between entropy and energy and temperature and so on, from the micro, you need some definition of what is entropy in the micro world. And you know, for instance, log of the number of microstates. It's kind of more subtle than temperature because now entropy is not a property. You cannot define it just by a single microstate. You have to ask how many microstates share with this microstate the macrostate property. So it's more subtle. But nevertheless, we have this mapping. Genes, again, you can think about genes as unit of heredity, and derive kind of macroscopic laws about it. But now you can say, well, no, it is sequence of nucleotides in parts of DNA or RNA, whatever, that are related or to encoding protein production, something like that. Okay, so that's a translation, the dictionary, and then what we do with this is the inter-theoretic reduction, which is stronger, which is not only we know what the macro theory or the high-level theory means in terms of the micro, we can interpret it in terms of the micro properties, but we can also derive the macroscopic laws or the high-level laws from the micro laws. That's a very strong statement that thermodynamics reduced to the micro physics means that from the micro physics, I can derive the thermodynamics law. Okay, so this inter-theoretic reduction. High-level theory is derived from low-level theory. All right, there are several notes to be made here. One is that this formulation is really very inert, very too formal, and doesn't really capture what we do in science with respect to reduction, because it's not simply there is a complete macro high-level theory that we can derive it now from the micro level theory. It's actually a very dynamic process by which typically understanding the microscopic system and the relation to macro is very often revising the macro. It's not simply, okay, now we have a theory, macro theory, and we reduce it. No, it's once we understand the relation, typically we change the macro theory, we extend it, we refine it, elaborate it. So reduction is not simply an intellectual exercise or philosophical statement. It's actually what we do most of the time in the lab or in the computation or the theory, and we basically very often want to derive new macroscopic high-level predictions, at least, or generalizations from the microscopic relation. So the scientific relation between macro and micro is much more dynamic and much more two-way relation. Okay, just I think that we all of us have to appreciate. So when we say reduction, we don't just mean a simple one-way relation. Okay, that's one comment. Another comment which I want to make is that that the question of the ability to derive the high-level laws from the low-level laws, from the macro from micro, you can ask whether it is a principle, in theory, or it is something that in practice we can do. Is it a practical statement that we can derive? We believe that with enough work we will be able to derive this, or we actually were successful in deriving it. And that's not obviously the very big gap between them. Okay. We'll come to those issues later on. Okay, but I want now to before we discuss those issues, I want to make to clarify two notions which are related but are not the same. Okay, one, I speak about high level and low level, macro level and micro level, okay, to the issue of scales, because very often we talk about macro scale versus micro scale. So I'm just giving you here two examples. One example is famous from David Marr's view of what computational neuroscience is, or okay, as a science. So, you know, computational level, the very 3 stages, very famous computational level is the most abstract level. What the computation level is specifying what is the computation that we think the brain is doing, or problem that the brain is solving, formulating the task. Second is formal algorithmic way of solving this. Okay, so if it's vision or language or whatever, writing down or formalizing an algorithmic solution. And then the last level is hardware or wet science, which is how those algorithms are implemented in the hardware, wetware of the brain. Okay, we cannot. I don't want to get into a long discussion about that. We might want to discuss it, but this is kind of levels of abstraction. So you can say, for instance, thermodynamics is kind of a more abstract kind of a theory than statistical mechanics, or genetics law, or Mendeleev's law are more abstract than molecular biology and so on. So, but then you can also talk about scales, and this is famous. This picture down here is famous from the book by Cherchen and Senovsky, Computational Neuroscience. It's again about different scales, spatial scales, and talk about studying the brain. So there is the molecular scale, the micro scale, then there is synaptic, then there is neurons, networks, all in terms of increasing spatial scales. Okay, so this is again micro versus macro. You can, you know, at the top is the entire brain, and the bottom is a molecule, and so on. But it's in terms of scales, and I don't want to get into it, but you can also talk about temporal scales, the scale of maybe a spike, or even ion channel, not ion channel, whatever the properties are, the scales are, and to the cognition and so on, which is maybe seconds and minutes and long-term memory. So there are also temporal scales, hierarchy of temporal scales. All right. So what I want to emphasize is that when we talk about reduction of a macroscopic theory to a microscopic theory, we do not mean that we are able to derive or explain the macro properties from looking at just at small scale, at the micro scale. Okay, sometimes this is what people understand in the reduction, and it's false. Okay, so if I want to understand perception, let's say this is on the scale of systems, I don't know, vision, I don't know. So this is maybe the entire visual system, the scale of 10 centimeters in this diagram. Okay, reducing it to the scale of molecules or neurons doesn't mean that I can explain perception or vision by looking just at single neurons. Single neurons don't have vision, obviously. Molecules don't have vision, and so on. So it's not simply going to microscopic scale and looking at smaller systems. Okay, that would be a mistake. So I want to just make sure that we agree on that. Macro to micro reduction does not imply derivation of macro scale properties from micro scale properties, from individual neurons or individual molecules and so on. Because almost all macroscopic properties are not valid at the microscopic scale. Okay, you cannot talk about the temperature of a single molecule or single atom. You cannot talk about entropy of a single atom, or you cannot talk about conductivity, electrical conductivity of a single electron, and so on and so forth. It's all properties of the aggregate, the macroscopic aggregate. So when we talk about reduction, we mean the reducing the understanding of the macro on the basis of micro is based on or relies on taps the resources of that reducibility is the properties of the individual microscopic components, but also their macroscopic interactions. And furthermore, their macroscopic spatial arrangements. So to derive the equation of state for a gas in a container, you will have to take the not only Newtonian mechanics, but you'll have also take into account the boundary, the geometry of this, the density, the number of particles, and so on and so forth. And the same for time. Okay, so that's more elaborate because people say, well, no, this is not reduced because there are boundary conditions. No, boundary conditions are part of how we understand the macro from the micro. And reducing doesn't mean that the properties of the macro exist already at the microscopic scale. Okay, it means that the properties of the microscopic system, the properties of individual components, plus the properties of the interaction, is what gives rise to the macro properties. Now, what about the boundary conditions? How come the boundary conditions are important? The boundary conditions, I may have said it in the past, I want to emphasize, when the boundary conditions figure or affect the properties of a system from the perspective of the microscience, it is because of the local interactions of the gas. Let's say if it's a gas in the container, the local interaction between the molecules of the gas and the molecules of the solid, of the walls of the container. And those local individual pairwise interactions are what conveys the information or what causes the dependence on the boundary condition, on the boundaries, okay? So that's important. So on the one hand side, I'm saying the reducibility to the micro depends very often on the macroscopic arrangement. So it sounds like, well, so it's not reducing to the microscopic because you're assuming some macroscopic constraints. On the other hand, I say no, because the way I understand the macroscopic constraint or the macroscopic arrangement is through their individual microscopic interaction. So when I'm trying to understand vision in terms of neural processes, in terms of even molecular processes, and so on, it does not mean that I think that a molecule or individual neuron has vision properties, okay? It means that I'm taking into account the number of neurons, their structure, the structure, I mean, not only of individual neurons, but how they are related to each other, the overall boundary conditions in terms of their interaction with the sensory system and so on. So it's a macroscopic scale. We are not going from the macroscopic scale to the microscopic scale. We are explaining the macroscopic scale properties in terms of microscopic laws, in terms of microscopic regularities, in terms of microscopic properties of single neurons and how neurons interact, and how neurons interact not only between themselves, but also with the blood and with the entire world and so on. But all these interactions are at the bottom local interactions of microscopic laws. Is this clear? Okay. So in this, but there is a point here which is important to, I think, to realize that in this process there is some break of universality, because the microscopic properties, including the interaction, are between individual molecules, and those interactions will be between those molecules, whatever it is, in the brain or in the heart, if these molecules happen to be there, or in the dish. Okay. On the other hand, the macroscopic properties that emerge from the microscopic science or laws and mechanism, as I said, are more restricted because they depend on the number of and the volume and the boundaries and so on and so forth. So there is a loss of universality involved in going from the microscopic physics to the macroscopic physics. But that's one way that things are. On the other hand, of course, you can say macroscopic properties in some way are more, can arise from different microscopic science. So this will be kind of different type of universality, and I'll come to that later on. So okay, that things have to be kept. It's straightforward, but should be kept in mind. All right, so what I want to say here just is that when we talk about David Marr, if we want to talk about this type of kind of more abstract, then the reduction is going from the other way, from the implementation to algorithm to computation, and that reduction has to involve all the scales. Okay, very good. So far I talked about what it means to reduce a high level to low level, or macro to micro. And now I want to say what's wrong with that. We can say, well, that explains the relation between different theories in the sciences. Why are people, or not everybody, is happy about that? There are problems with that. There are several. One is kind of metaphysical, or you can say religion, or some other commitment that it can't be that life is just a collection of molecules that with their interaction. Life is something different, coming from something different, or the mind, spirits, maybe God, or maybe whatever. Metaphysical commitments that reduction cannot be the story, the entire story. But more to the point, I think, is the failure, because if we think about reduction, not as philosophy or metaphysics, as agenda, which most of the sciences are doing, scientists are doing, trying to dissect things and find the mechanisms in lower and lower levels, it is fine, but it's also, unfortunately, a failure in many areas, okay? So we still, for instance, in cognitive neuroscience, we're still very far away in understanding cognition, really what conditions are and what are the mechanisms in the micro level, but not only in the mind, but also in the physical sciences. Physical sciences, physics, for instance, is the enormous success of physics. The 20th century was declared the century of physics, rightly so. But the enormous success is because physics is limited to extremely simple systems, at equilibrium, homogeneous, or very small scale, microscopic scale. But when physics became more colonial, imperialist, and physicists expanded the domain of interest to more complex systems, amorphous system, glasses, heterogeneous materials, turbulence, and so on and so forth, things are not as nice, and the successes are very moderate. And you may know that in the, I don't know, you're too young, but you may have heard, but I remember then I did my postdoc and so on, and looked for topics and so on. one of the buzzwords was complexity science, science of complexity. And it's still, some scientists think, okay, there is a new science of complexity. Or for instance, non-equilibrium thermodynamics. There is still a school of scientists that think that we can extend thermodynamics to non-equilibrium domains. But in my view, both are failures, in the sense that the ambition to really write down a very universal laws for complex systems, non-equilibrium systems, and so on, I think so far failed. Okay, and what instead came is kind of more local and more specific or more dirty kind of science. So the reduction of the macroscopic properties of systems which are heterogeneous, random, complex in their structure and complex in their dynamics, namely very non-equilibrium, open systems, and so on. The reduction to the microscopic laws is not so, has not been so successful. Not to say about biology and about neuroscience and so on. Okay, so scientists, even within science, before philosophizing, were kind of forced to think about emergent phenomena. Okay, this is something that we cannot simply, there is no linear, simple relation between the microscopic phenomena, the macroscopic phenomena. It's kind of a little bit miraculous. It is emergent, collective, emergent, whatever, okay? So it was a pressure within science, within physics even, to really categorize certain macroscopic properties by saying they are not, the relation between them and the microscopic is more subtle, more complex. And if you go beyond physics, there is a dissatisfaction. You can say it is social. You can say it's also competing for resources, from grants and so on, public support. So there are a variety of pressures, not to say everything is reduced to physics. So imagine you are a chemist and all your life you studied chemistry, and chemistry was everything. Chemistry is life and chemistry is stars and whatever. And now a physicist comes and tell you, well, everything is reduced to quantum mechanics. Okay, now you're, okay, no, it's, you will resist, you'll tend to resist it, right? Similarly, if we are system neuroscientists or cognitive neuroscientists, then somebody will tell, no, it's all molecular biology. Once we understand molecular biology, we understand everything. You will not be happy, right? You will say, no, it's not so. There is something. There is explanatory gap. There is something that makes what's called special sciences autonomous. Chemistry is a special science and is some autonomy from physics. Biology from maybe physics and chemistry and so on and so forth. Okay? Quest for autonomy of special sciences. All right. So in physics, if you talk about problems with reduction, again, I'll give you some historical perspectives. Some contemporary physicists, well-known, Nobel laureate, thought about this issue. So Freeman Dyson says reductionism in physics is the effort to reduce the world of physical phenomena to a finite set of fundamental equations. So it's not only macro to micro, but everything should just be a set of 4 equations. That's it. Steve Weinberger, famously very committed to reductionism, he didn't talk about equations, but he talked all of nature is the way it is, with certain qualifications about initial conditions and so on. Nature is it is, the way it is, because of simple universal laws to which all other scientific laws may in some sense be reduced. He's a very famous, strong reductionist. And by the way, again, I'm telling you historical context because I think it's important to know that the question about reductionism, not reductionism, is not only scientific, philosophical, but it's also social and even economical. And there was a big fight within physics whether to request the US federal government to build the superconductor collider in Texas for particle physics. The federal government already invested billions of dollars on that, or $1 or $2 billion in building it, but then it decided to stop it, and then CERN, the European, built it, and they came first, and until today they are the first in terms of particle high energy physics. And at that time, this was the heart of the debate whether it is worthwhile investing so much public money in deciphering the fundamental microscopic laws, discovering the Higgs particle or whatever, where this money could be invested in condensed matter physics and applied materials and so on and so forth. Okay, so Weinberg and followers said, no, physics, basically everything is fundamental physics. We understand fundamental physics, we understand everything. And one of the prominents, in the opposite camp was Phil Anderson, some sense one of my mentors, and I admire him as an unusual physicist in condensed matter physics. He wrote a famous paper in Science, 1972, More is Different. And that paper is quoted every time we talk about reductionism in physics or not. We quote Phil Anderson paper, More is Different. And scientists and philosophers, so now there is, not now, there was a philosophers follow-up article say more is the same. And there is another paper say less is different, and so on. So this became a metaphor. More is different. So what he says is the following: the reductionist hypothesis may still be a topic for controversy among philosophers, but among the great majority of active scientists, I think it is accepted without question. The working of our mind and bodies, and all of the animate or inanimate matter of which we have any detailed knowledge, are assumed to be controlled by the same set of fundamental laws. And these fundamental laws are fundamental physics. There is no question about it in this context. So in that case, again, he is a physicalist, he is a reductionist, but he doesn't say no more than, okay? And that's what he said. The main fallacy is that the reductionist hypothesis does not by any means imply a constructionist one. The ability to reduce everything to simple fundamental laws does not imply the ability to start from those laws and reconstruct the universe. And he goes on in saying the constructionist hypothesis breaks down when confronted with the twin difficulties of scale and complexity. The behavior of large and complex aggregates of elementary particles, it turns out, is not to be understood in terms of simple extrapolation of the properties of a few particles. Instead, at each level of complexity, new properties appear. More is different. Larger system, complex system, large and complex, new properties appear at each level of complexity. Okay, so he defends not autonomy of special sciences, but autonomy of special physics. He defends the autonomy of condensed matter physics from particle physics, from high energy physics, and so on and so forth. Okay, so he has two arguments, and it's not easy to understand, elaborate what he means. So one of them, he says, reductionism versus constructivism. So he said constructivism says that you can start from the fundamental laws and reconstruct the universe. So what does it mean that it's not possible? So we saw that Nagel's reductionism says if it is reducible, number two, H-level theory is derived, should be able to derive from L-level theory. So Phil Anderson is a physicist, very intuitive and not philosopher. He doesn't tell us what he means by saying that it's not possible to start from those laws and reconstruct the universe, whether it means it's not practical or in principle it's not possible. I don't know. We can discuss it. I don't want to elaborate, but I have some ideas about what it might mean, but let's leave it aside. And the same, he says, in this, at each level of complexity, new properties appear. Okay, what does it mean? That it cannot be understood in terms of simple extrapolation. Okay, so we can say, well, it's not a simple extrapolation, but nevertheless, okay. So there is a sentiment of emergence that in large and complex systems, new phenomena emerge, but there is no clarity of what it means, new phenomena, and what is the relation between them and the fundamental microscopic law. Okay, so here is another Nobel laureate in physics, Bob Laughlin. I don't know, you don't know what high TC superconductivity. Everybody knows what high TC superconductivity, everybody heard about it. So this kind of superconductors, materials that have become superconductor, that show superconductivity, not at a very low temperature like the classical one, but it is temperature which is higher. Everybody wants room temperature. It's not room temperature, but still much higher than, so it's called high TC superconductivity. And for many, many years, decades, physicists struggled to understand the origin of this superconductivity. I won't go into it, but I remember the wars and battles and fights and about what's going on in those materials. What is the microscopic mechanism that generates this high TC superconductivity? But Bob Laughlin says at the end, paradoxically, high TC continues to be the most important problem in solid state physics and perhaps physics generally, not because it is such an important phenomenon. It's not. It is important mostly for practical reasons, because if you can have superconductivity at room temperature, the applicability, engineering application, technological applications of this would be enormous, because you don't have, trains, superconductor rails, and so on, and many, many things could be constructed with room temperature. However, his argument is because this very richness of behavior and the inability to explain them strongly suggests the presence of a fundamentally new and unprecedented kind of quantum emergence. Not only emergence, quantum emergence. Okay, so I want to tell you, Phil Anderson, Laughlin, and others, famous, distinguished Nobel laureates in physics, sometimes they use rhetorics that I think extend beyond what can be defended on scientific terms. Okay, so I'm telling you that to be critical. Okay, on one hand, say, okay, but this is Nobel. This is what he said. Phil Anderson said. This is Bob Laughlin, Nobel laureate. This is what Roger Sperry. This is what. On the other hand, you have to know all of us are human beings, and it's, as I said already, it's a combination of subjective perspective and other interests, important interests. Interests not personal, but community and funding for what our science and our enterprise, and also lack of clarity. We are scientists, okay, so we wrote this in an opinion, we wrote this in a PNS paper, but yeah, okay. We're not taking it necessarily serious, okay. So you have to be careful. Bob Laughlin, for instance, in this case, I'm bringing it is because a few years later, a distinguished physicist wrote down and said, wrote papers and said, well, we now finally understand high DC superconductivity in terms of the microphysics. We understand it. Okay, nothing. Okay, no drama. All right, so I think some physicists used emergence in too extreme connotation. It's a new quantum emergence, or what Phil Anderson says, at each level of complexity, new properties appear. Well, maybe right, but it's not so dramatic as these words imply. All right. It's also in biology. Let's read what famous virologists write about reduction in complexity in molecular biology. The reductionist method of dissecting biological systems into their constituent parts has been effective in explaining the chemical basis of numerous living processes. However, many biologists now realize that this approach has reached its limit. Biological systems are extremely complex and have emergent properties that cannot be explained or even predicted by studying their individual parts. The reductionist approach, although successful in the early days of molecular biology, underestimated this complexity and therefore has an increasing detrimental influence on many areas of biomedical research, including drug discovery and vaccine development.
But
He's
Haim,
right.
Again, can I ask, is this a practical problem or a theoretical problem? Is it too complex for us to explain now because of the computational limitations we have, or is it too complex to explain in principle? And if then, how do they prove that?
So I think there are several sentiments here. One sentiment is going back to what I said about scales versus levels. Because, for instance, in molecular biologists, we are hoping, as you all know, that once we understand the action of individual genes, we'll solve medicine, right? That there is a, single gene, single trait mapping. Okay, so that's a fallacy of thinking about reduction as trying to explain the properties of a complex system by the properties of individual elements of it. Okay, and he's right in the sense that we now know that this hope is only in extreme cases really working. To understand now the mechanism of disease, we have to really take into account multiple pathways and interactions between genes and so on and so forth. It's well known. So in that sense, he is right, but it just means reduction has to be reduction in the proper sense of taking into account the complexity of the micromechanisms. But then I agree with you that couples with this realization is the realization that if this is the case, then it's enormously practically complicated thing, enterprise. But there is no way out of it. We are not going to find a vaccine without sorting out those pathways, okay? So, again, what I'm trying to say, whenever you see such statements, you have to really understand what the argument is. And to me, it's not arguments against reduction. It's an argument against naive reduction of a macroscopic scale to a microscopic small systems scale, which is naive and of course wrong. In most cases, it fails, okay? So in that sense, he's right, but it doesn't mean that to develop vaccine, you can do it without understanding this complexity of the microscopic pathways. That's the way I will say. So
Haim,
it will be, in my view, it will be a disaster if this is in principle impossible. In my view, then we're stuck. But I'll come to, yes, the question is, let me take questions, because I think I'll elaborate this in the second part of my lecture today. So before the break, are there more questions on this?
I had a question. How is non-naive reductionism different from non-reductionism? Like, how do you differentiate?
The non-reductionism would say that even if you take into, even if you have a complete knowledge, and I think some of those statements said, if you have a complete knowledge of the microscopic realm, you still cannot predict the macroscopic behavior. That's a much stronger statement. Okay, it doesn't say, well, if you know individual neurons, if you know all the part of individual neurons, you cannot predict cognition. It says, even if you know how neurons interact, okay, you know everything about neuronal processes, you still cannot predict perception or cognition. That would be non-reductionist statement. Now, is it because it is hard or because in principle it's not possible? Okay, but that's not a naive reduction. That's a statement which is against even non-naive reduction. It says, take into account all the complete knowledge of the microscopic regularities and properties and behaviors. There's still something novel that comes out of the macro level that you cannot predict. Now, what does it mean? As Liad said, and as I said at the beginning, about practical versus not practical, does it mean it's simply very extremely difficult and impossible? For instance, if you want to try to explain the properties of a macroscopic object, my mug and my coffee, and I start from quantum mechanics, there is no way, right? It's silly, right? That's fine. It's not controversial. It is a statement, but it's not controversial. Some properties we are able, and others we simply impossible. Or it means that in theory it's impossible. That would be a bolder statement. Okay, that would be a bolder statement. This would mean that we are physicalists. We believe that a change in the macroscopic properties cannot happen without a change in the microscopic properties, but still we cannot derive the laws of the macroscopic behavior. That's more problematic. And I'm not going to defend it because I myself skeptical. As I said, I'm not sure that I'll subscribe. Okay, but more questions. Okay, I elaborate on it to some extent for personal reasons, because when I grew up as a physicist, young physicist, all these, I was in the middle of an environment at Bell Labs with Phil Anderson and others, luminaries, and Laughlin and others, and the debates about emergence. This was every day, emergence, emergence, emergence. And the question is, okay, what it means. So we all use it, emergent phenomena, collective phenomena, computational neuroscience. But when we try to make kind of take it as kind of a metaphysical statement, we have to make sure that we understand whether we are meaning strong emergence or weaker emergence, in the sense, there are many senses, but in one sense here, it is whether it means that in practice we cannot derive macroscopic laws from microscopic laws because some of the macroscopic behaviors is too complex, the relation is too complex, or that there is a gap. there is really a divide. All right, okay. We will continue to discuss some of these issues after the break, but let's take 10 minutes break. Oh, it's late, so let's be back at 25 past 5. Yeah. Okay. It's not possible to start from the fundamental laws and reconstruct. I believe that in principle it is possible, first of all. And secondly, I hope that we can make practical progress in this agenda, because if it's not practical, we are stuck. I want to emphasize that the issue of reductionism in this sense, in terms of constructing, as you said, is an important, is not philosophically, is an important issue of agenda in science, because if it is impossible, either in principle or it's not practical, then we are stuck. Then what are we going to do? What will be the alternative? We know that psychology by itself is not going to is not powerful enough. But whether it means to do it like a blue brain or to do it in a more intelligent way, it's a different story, right? Blue brain essentially denies emergence in any even weaker sense, right? That's the idea that you can, by simulating the microscopic laws, you can understand the macro. What I mean is the following. There are two issues in the reconstruct the universe. I think Phil Anderson does not mean building. What he means is understanding, reconstructing the properties of the macro. Okay. There's another theme in science. Richard Feynman, I think, is quoted to say, if you cannot build it, you don't understand it. That's reconstruction in a different sense. This is reconstruction in the sense, what Phil Anderson means reconstruction here is not reconstruct the universe in the sense of simulating or building it, but reconstructing the properties, the regularities, the laws. Okay, but that's another extreme, even more extreme view, that in order that you just have to reconstruct in the sense of simulating or in the sense of building. And that, I think, is the fallacy of, in my view, of the Blue Brain Project, that it's enough to reconstruct in silico by simulating the process, the microprocesses, then you understood, and I think that's a failure. That's wrong. But it's not. But I do hope that by studying by the microscopic at whatever level, relevant level, and understand the properties, derive the macroscopic behavior from the microscopic is something which I think is very valid, and I believe we are making progress, and we will make even more progress, and we have to do even more of that. Okay. But that's not the same reconstruct as reconstruction by simulating or by building. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
What progress are we making?
What?
You said before that we're making progress. What progress are you talking about in understanding these properties of the brain?
In cognitive neuroscience, for instance?
Yes.
Well, we have discussed some, we have surveyed some of it, we can discuss it. I think we understand fundamental features of learning and memory. In other words, the microscopic mechanism, synaptic plasticity, and even maybe more micro level. But let's say the relation between synaptic plasticity and some forms of memory and learning.
We
a
still don't
progress.
have like the unit of learning, for example.
What?
We still don't have like the, I don't know, the unit of learning, of memory or something like that. We don't understand things like that. We know what action potential is, but we can't really see how it amounts to, I don't know, a memory or something like that.
I'm not sure I understand what you, when you talk about action potential.
No, like for example, in genes, like we have, nucleotide, like we understand that the units. But when you talk about learning and memory, you don't really have units that you can understand.
Well, again, it's not going to be simple. As we said, we have units if you want. Synaptic plasticity is one unit, one element, one mechanism. We talk about mechanism. Units is not. I think the question is the microscopic mechanisms. Can we explain some aspects of learning and memory by microscopic mechanisms? And I'm saying it. There is theoretical and empirical evidence supporting the hypothesis that synaptic plasticity plus structural plasticity in some cases, both of them are causally related to some forms of memory and learning. This is an example. I think this is a correct statement. Okay. Now we can go further down to a more microscopic level and ask, do we understand synaptic plasticity mechanisms in terms of molecular processes to some or structural plasticity? And to a large degree, yes, but of course only to partial degree. And I will agree with you that there are some forms of learning for which we don't yet know how to relate to synaptic plasticity. Okay, but this is an example. Okay, vision. Some aspects of vision, of visual perception, we can relate to properties of even single neurons or an aggregates of neurons. Okay? Not all aspects of vision we know how to relate to the neuronal properties, but some of them, yes. Even I would say object perception to some degree is understood in terms of neuronal patterns of activity. So that's a progress. It's not going to be simple. It's not going to be, okay, I have a neuron with these properties and therefore this is, as I said, reduction, it doesn't mean naive reduction. But we are very far from it, I agree. But I think we're making tremendous progress over the last, I don't know, 50 years. Don't you agree?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I agree for sure.
Okay, so I'm saying that we can, it will be interesting to devote a session on discussing it, because people, very often people ask, okay, what have we achieved in cognitive neuroscience, in computational neuroscience, system neuroscience? Have we made progress? It's a valid question, because it's easy to make progress when you measure the properties of molecule or even single neuron and so on. It's not easy to capture the tremendous progress that we have made in understanding cognition in terms of neuroscience. But we are very far. I'm not saying that the more high level, the higher level we go in terms of the macro, in terms of the question that we ask, the further down the road we are. Consciousness. I mean, I think we're very far. And many other things. Emotion, for instance, is an example where tremendous progress has been made in relating microscopic mechanisms in causal way to emotion. And many other things. I mean, I think we have made a tremendous progress, but it's very far from our reaching our goal. That's my view, but okay. More comments and questions? All right, okay. So let me elaborate about emergence. As I said, emergence is kind of a stand, a position which tries to eat the cake and keep it whole, untouched at the same time, but it's fine. It is the world is complex, and there is a tension here, but it's fine, which is something in between reduction, kind of brutal reduction, and autonomy, saying independence. So I would say macro complex systems exhibit novel / nonlinear / surprising behavior, the description of which requires a novel set of concepts and laws that do not bear simple relation to the underlying microscopic laws. Thus, emergent phenomena are in some sense independent of the fundamental laws of physics, or more general, of the lower laws, whatever it is. This is my definition of emergence. When I would say the mind is emergent, or perception is emergent from neuroscience, from neural processes, and so on and so forth, that's what I mean. I would mean that there is the relation between the micro and the macro is not a trivial. Let me give you a trivial relation. The total mass of a piece of matter, it's a macro property, the mass, but it's simply a sum of the masses of the of the molecules. It's not only a relation, a kind of trivial relation, a kind of linear, but not even linear, sum, okay? Or energy. The macro energy is simple relation. Nobody will say energy of a piece of matter is emergent property. It's not sum of the properties of individual elements, okay? But some of the macro properties, the relation to the micro is more surprising, more nonlinear, more complex to understand. Okay, so let's try to do some work. I see already that I way underestimated my progress. Anyway, there are two aspects here in emergence: commitment to relation to the microscopic, to reduction, in some sense. I want to emphasize this. If I believe the mind is something else from the brain, then there is no emergence, because then there is no relation. Emergence, to me, goes together with reduction, some form of reduction. And that relation is phrased, formalized in philosophy by supervenience. I'll explain to you. If you are not committed to that, some form of that supervenience, nismachut, בעברית, nismachut, supervenience, then it's not emergent, then it's something else. Okay, good. The other thing is novelty. So that's the tension between supervenience and novelty. That's the flavor that is called emergence. And then I'll come to the other things. Okay, so what is supervenience? Supervenience is the commitment that the macro system described by the H high-level theory constitutes of elements and forces obeying the low-level laws. And that the macro states of processes are instantiated and realized by macro state and processes, okay? So it means that so this is, in the diagram below, there is P and M, physical and mental, but think even in physics, micro and macro, okay? It means that every macro property, okay, is supervenes on micro, or every mental to physical, or any macro to micro, in the sense, in the weak sense at least, that every time a system has the same micro state, the same P state in this case, it necessarily will show the same macro state, okay? So you cannot have two different macro states without having in relation two different micro states, okay? You cannot vary the macro properties without varying the micro properties. because every macro state is instantiated, is realized by a particular configuration of the micro constituents of the system. Okay? That's a commitment, that's supervenience. Okay? Okay, that's understood. So two L identical systems, two low-level identical systems, two systems that have the same configuration of neurons, let's say, with the interaction and so on, necessarily will have the same cognition. Okay, so if you are able to reconstruct my brain by taking neurons outside, but connecting them, reconnecting them, and having the same configuration, etc., the same physical configuration, you will have the same cognition as what I have now. Okay, that's supervenience. Okay, good. But
would you agree that supervenience means that P fully determines M that is not identical to it? Would that be a definition you would accept?
I would say supervenience means that the physical state fully determines the, I'm sorry, not the mental or the micro state, fully determines the macro state completely. But now, whether it's identical or not, I leave it open. I don't want to push it into identity theory and so on, because, but at least, and the identity has problems when you talk about multiple reliability. So that's later on. So I don't want to make such a strong statement. It's more weak statement that once you fully characterize the microscopic configuration, that determines the macroscopic properties. You cannot, okay. It's a weaker statement. Okay, so let's talk about novelty. So in physics, it's at least in physics, when we say emergent properties, that they are novel, there is a meaning, there is a more concrete meaning than maybe in other sciences and other cases. Okay, for instance, when we talk about a piece of matter that it is liquid or gas or solid, kind of phase diagram down here, or phase transition. So this is temperature and this is pressure. So in one regime of the phase diagram, it is solid. Another regime, it's liquid. Another regime, it is gas, and so on and so forth. These are novel in the sense that small number of atoms or molecules do not exhibit that. It's not something that it is relevant to a small number of the microscopic constituents. It appears only in the aggregate and under certain condition of the aggregate. Okay, so it's not like mass or energy or magnetization. Okay, the entire, you cannot say take a collection of 10 molecules and say, well, they are in gas or they are solid. There's no meaning. So it's not that it is right or wrong, it's simply irrelevant. So those states, those macro states, some of the macro states are completely novel in the sense that we can understand how they derive from the micro, but still they're novel in the sense that they are not relevant when we talk about smaller, microscopically smaller systems. The same in black holes, viruses, and so on and so forth. It's clear. There is even more extreme or more notions of novelty. Arrow of time, we discussed it, right? Second law of thermodynamics. Again, this is a classical example of emergent property in terms of novelty. No matter, okay, we can explain perhaps the origin of that when we go from micro to macro, whatever is our theory. But nevertheless, it's a fundamentally new phenomenon in the sense that you break a symmetry going from the micro to macro. So that's what physicists would say it's novel. Symmetry is holy grail of fundamental physics. That the laws are symmetric, and when you have such a macroscopic universal behavior, which breaks the symmetry, this fundamental symmetry, this is novelty, this is emergent. Okay, pattern formation. But in physics, in modern physics, this notion that certain macroscopic properties violates underlying symmetry, it's called spontaneous symmetry breaking. And in modern physics, it is very prevalent. It's one of the tenets, how modern physics explains the world, explains the pattern around us. So the very existence of particles of certain properties, elementary particles, certain properties, particles, antiparticles, etc., are all results of what physicists call spontaneous symmetry breaking. What does it mean? It means that the underlying laws are symmetric. And if the particles themselves violate the symmetry, break the symmetry. So the simple trivial case is, imagine you have a piece of magnet and there is no external magnetic field, then you would expect that the underlying law is completely symmetric to changing the sign, the direction of the magnetization of the matter. And indeed, at high temperature, that's what happens. Every spin is fluctuating in its magnetization. But when you cool down the system below a certain temperature, there is a phase transition which breaks the symmetry, and all of a sudden, all the spins point and keep pointing in one direction. So it violates the up-down or the rotational symmetry. So spontaneous symmetry breaking is a phenomena which occurs in ordinary condensed matter, macroscopic physics, but also at the level of elementary particles. In both cases, it has to do with the fact that the world is macroscopic. In one case, it's simply macroscopic. In other cases, we called it the underlying physics is fields, and fields are an infinite number of degrees of freedom, as we discussed in electromagnetism. So the world fundamentally is not particles, but fields. And this is kind of macroscopic entity, infinite number of degrees of freedom, which when they cool down, they break the symmetry. So spontaneous symmetry breaking is a phenomenon in physics, which is a feature of the macroscopic system, without which we cannot understand the world around us in any meaning. Okay, and I go back to Phil Anderson. Phil Anderson spoke about new phenomena occurs, or that you cannot reconstruct the universe. This is what he meant. Phil Anderson is one of the discoverers of the mechanism of spontaneous symmetry breaking in condensed matter physics, and also in high energy physics. Anyway, so that's what he had in mind. The fact that you have this spontaneous symmetry breaking, which do not occur at a small scale. Okay, so if you take a small number of spins, at least at finite temperature, no matter what the temperature is, they always will fluctuate and go from up to down and so on. Once you go to macroscopic scale, you get this symmetry breaking. And the transition from a liquid to a solid breaks the symmetry of the positional symmetry, translational symmetry, and so on and so forth. So all matters around us are the results of patterns that emerge from symmetry breaking. That's the canonical example of emergence in physics. Patterns at the macroscopic scale emerged by the mechanism of spontaneous symmetry breaking. Okay, spontaneous symmetry breaking, I want to emphasize, it's not something which is magic. We understand the mechanism. However, the mechanism is very subtle, very complex. It's subtle in the sense that what breaks that symmetry can be small impurities, small magnetic fields, small fluctuations, quantum fluctuations in the cosmological theories, some tiny inhomogeneities in Big Bang or whatever, some small accidental perturbations in initial conditions or in forces are enough to break the symmetry, okay? They have enormous effect, okay? But we understand the mechanism, okay? Nevertheless, it's very hard to predict in which way or another it will happen, okay? Because by the very nature of the sensitivity of that phenomenon. So it is emergent. Okay, there is another uniqueness in this phenomena of symmetry breaking and phase transitions in physics, which are emergent. Not only that it is breaking the symmetry in a kind of unpredictable way in some sense, but also from theoretical perspective, when I say macro, it occurs only on the macro scale. You can ask, you know, the Bordian monkeys question, when is macro? I say finite number is not enough, so when is macro? The answer is macro is infinite, what's called thermodynamic limit, okay? So if you are looking at the transition between a liquid and a solid, that transition will not exist for any finite collection of molecules or atoms. Theoretically, you will have to take the limit of infinite volume and infinite number of particles, keeping the density constant, and that limit you break the symmetry. The symmetry is healed in any finite. Now that's of course a mathematical construct because our world is not infinite, but it's big enough that it's virtually behaves like an infinite system. But from a theoretical perspective, you see here how we can, if we insist, you can actually define what emergent property of a system is. Emergent property, if I would have to define what it is a property such as symmetry breaking and so on, but a property that exists only in the thermodynamic limit. And of course, with a very good approximation for a very large system, but this will be a criterion, okay? And I think that's one way to make sense of emergence in physics. Okay. Okay, let me finish by one more point, which is at the heart of emergence and reduction question, but it will come up next week also in a more substantial way when we talk about mental and physical, and this is multiple realizability. So if I go back to the list of what is emergence, so supervenous novelty, but also multiple realizability. So going back to this picture, okay? So Liad asked whether that means also there is identity between the physical and mental, or between the micro and macro. And one reason why I don't want to commit to this is because of multiple realizability, because enormous number of different physical states on the microscopic level will have the same macroscopic properties, or physical to mental, whatever it is, okay? And I want to make a distinction. So that's known in philosophy about multiple realizability. And that's a big thing. And I want to, in physics, I want to make a distinction between two types. One type, which is benign or more benign than the other. Benign type says that macro states, when we talk about macro states, every macro state is associated, characterizes a whole ensemble of microstates. Well, when we talked about thermodynamics, that's how we define thermodynamics. We said we have macroscopic variables, magnetization, energy, whatever, pressure, volume, density, whatever, and then they are characterizing a whole ensemble of microstates. Okay, so that's one kind of multiple realizability. I call it dynamic multiple realizability. For me, it is fine. It is, we know there is no mystery here. Another kind is structural multiple realizability, which is less intuitive, which says that some very often we see the same macro properties for systems that are not only different momentarily microstates, but structurally are different. They have different constituents, different interactions, different types of molecules. Nevertheless, they show some commonality in the macro properties. That's more less clear. Okay. So, for instance, for those of you that know some modern theory of phase transition, there is a critical point here in this diagram, which is the transition between gas and a liquid gas transition. So when you cross this point, when you change temperature and pressure, you go from gas and liquid, and there are critical properties. I don't want to get into it. Universal laws that characterize this transition. Okay. It turns out that these critical properties are the same properties that characterize the transition from a paramagnet to ferromagnet in some magnetic systems. Completely different systems, different microscopic interaction. This is magnetic variable degrees of freedom, and here it is mechanical degrees of freedom, interaction between molecules, their motion, and so on and so forth. Completely different microscopic mechanisms. So now the question is, in what sense, what unites all these systems which are structurally different, what unites them to have the same macro properties? Okay, that's harder to explain, okay? I don't want to, so here is an example. I'll finish with that. Here is an example of a phase transition where there is a temperature on the right-hand side, on the y-axis, temperature relative to critical temperature in one, and density of molecules relative to some critical density. And this is a transition, as I said before, gas in one side, liquid in another side, some mixture in the middle, part is gas, part is liquid. And you see here a list of different particles, different gases. All of them fit not only qualitatively, but quantitatively. All of them lie on the same curve. That's universality. It's called in physics universality. Okay, and that it's not that the same system has different microstates. Different systems, different constituents. All of them quantitatively lie the same, and they have the same correlation and the same power laws and so on and so forth. This is what modern phase transition critical phenomena discovered in the last maybe 50 or 70 years of and we understand, physics understand the origin of this universality, but this is harder to explain. How come physical systems that are so different in their microscopic constituents, they share the same precise macroscopic properties? Okay, so the question is how to understand. How can you say, okay, so identity won't work here? I mean, it's different systems. Nevertheless, it's surprising, but we understand in physics how it comes about, how this universality comes about. And I have 1 minute. I'll just tell you the key to this is understanding what's known as renormalization group in physics. And the key to that is the fact that when you look at the system in a larger, if you take a microscope and you increase, you coarse grain, the scale, the spatial scale, you average more and more degrees of freedom in a systematic way, you can show how different microscopic systems, when you look at them at a larger and larger scale, as you vary the scale, you start from one system, and that system is changing into an effectively different system as you increase the scale, you coarse grain the system until you reach a fixed point, which is the largest scale that you macroscopic scale. And this fixed point, so this is now what I'm plotting here now is different systems. So this y-axis and x-axis here are like different systems, different types of interaction strength and so on and so forth, different microscopic parameters. And the fact that there are fixed points, stable fixed points here, means that many different systems, microscopically, when you average out degrees of freedom and you look at coarser and coarser scale, they become similar to each other. And so similar that they approach, all of them, one fixed point system. And this regime here, another fixed point system. So that's the idea of renormalization group in physics, that explains how a whole space of different, microscopically different systems behave the same on a macroscopic scale. When you increase the size, when you coarse grain, when you increase the spatial scale at which you measure the properties of the system, you average more and more degrees of freedom. You converge into a fixed point, but all these different systems converge into that fixed point. Okay, so the upshot is that in physics, we see on one hand side this multiple realizability, but we understand it in terms of universality, macroscopic universality, and the mathematical apparatus and also conceptual apparatus is what's known as renormalization group, that explains how vastly different systems converge when you look at them on the macroscopic scale to one behavior. In this regime, to this behavior, this will be, let's say, gas. In this regime, all of them will converge to a liquid behavior, and so on and so forth. The question is, and I'll stop here, is whether we can take this notion of renormalization group and universality of macro to other domains of science and inquiry. In particular, neuroscience or biology in general. Is this mechanism or this explanation valid there as well? That will be the topic that we'll start with next week. Okay, so next week will be mental to physical. What can we say about them after we have surveyed some of the emergent reduction scale in physics? Okay? Question about that?
Hi.
Yeah.
When I think about supervenience and multiple realizability, I tend to compare it to software and hardware. Do you think it's a useful analogy?
This analogy will be the topic that we'll discuss next week. Okay? And I can tell you already what the difficulty is. Here, we can understand in the example, in the physics example, there is something common. If you ask why this group of systems, all of them show one macroscopic behavior, and other groups of systems show other macroscopic behavior. On one hand side, it's enormous multiple realizability. But we understand using a normalization group the difference. For instance, although the details of the interactions are different, what will be important is the symmetries, is the range of the interaction, is the dimensionality. So physics tells us what aspects of the microscopic properties are relevant to the macroscopic behavior and what aspects are not. Okay, here that's precisely what renormalization group is telling us. We'll say this microscopic variable is not important on the macroscopic scale, but whether there is an external magnetic field or not, that's very important because this breaks the symmetry. What is the range of the interaction? Is it short range or very long range? Is it 2 dimension or 1 dimension or 3 dimension and so on? So there is an understanding of the features, the physical features that unite all these microstates or microscopically different systems into one macro system, and here to another macro system. Okay, so it's not that the entire world is universal. There are universality classes, and we understand what microscopic properties are defining the different universality classes. When you go from hardware to software, it's not clear.
What is not clear?
It's not clear what aspects of the hardware are responsible for them being executing software 1 versus software 2, or computation 1 versus computation 2.
I mean, it would be this circle and this diode. I mean, you can break it down.
You can take a given circuit and a given circuit, and you can say, this is the input. If I put this input, I get this output. Okay, so this circuit executes this algorithm or this function. But to go the other way around, to ask what are common to all other possible physical realizations or physical circuits or physical, not even circuit. Let's say I can do the same input-output relation with a wind blowing in a pipe, if I know how to map it to this input-output. Can I say that there is something common? Besides the fact that they all do the same software, which is, of course. Is there something common in their hardware that explains or causes the fact that they are executing the same algorithm? I don't know. I think it's open question, and I'm not sure that the answer is yes. I don't know, but that's the difference. In physics, I can say what are the features that, and I can understand, of course, why. It's not just saying, it's just I understand why these features are responsible for this macroscopic behavior, and understand why different systems have the same macroscopic properties through these theories that I mentioned. But I don't know what unites all possible physical realizations of a system that maps a certain input-output.
You're going to elaborate on this next week?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
Looking forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's one of the questions in taking the metaphors from physics to other domains, computation, cognitive, and so on and so forth. That would be discussed next week. Okay.